Okay, so this EdPuzzle is going to focus on amniotes, which of course are chordates that share the derived character of having an amniotic egg. So we're going to focus on basically what are the advantages to that, how that affected the evolution of amniotes, and focus particularly on the characteristics of reptiles and specifically birds, which we know are our only surviving dinosaur lineage. And then, of course, we're going to end up talking about the shared derived characters of mammals and the different mammal groups and mammal evolution, which of course includes humans.
So in a way, the evolution that we're looking at in tetrapods kind of parallels what we were looking at in plants, right? So we have our ferns are confined to, and our bryophytes for the most part as well, confined to moist environments because the sperm has to swim to the egg. And so when you no longer had to do that, right, you had this game changer of a seed, suddenly you could colonize dry habitats and you could live in a whole lot more different types of conditions. And the same thing has happened with between amphibians and reptiles. So again, you have amphibians diverge, they go down their particular evolutionary trajectory. And then reptiles, excuse me, pardon me, sort of go the other way. You have the evolution of the amniotic egg. And this basically takes that nice, moist, essentially like a little pond that you are wrapped in. I don't want to say a shell. It's the shell is, well, I mean, it is a shell, but we always think of a shell as being hard, right? And that's actually a lot of amniotic eggs. That's not the case. The shell is actually leathery. It's very gas permeable. In some cases, it's just a membrane. But basically, an amniotic egg is just multiple membranes that are wrapped around this wonderful little aquatic environment. And so you can take basically your pond to go. And that was, again, this was a huge breakthrough for the ancestors of reptiles and mammals, which are also known as amniotes because of the amniotic egg. So very much like a seed, now suddenly we can colonize dry environments, and reptiles did, and they did extremely well in hot and dry environments because they can take that wonderful wet a pond and coming from inside the body and lay an egg that's leathery. It can do all the gas exchange that it needs to do, but that keeps the moisture in. This was really a key adaptation. Another change you see in amniotes is, as I mentioned, the change in breathing. So using the rib cage instead of throat muscles. This is just something that allows amniotes to basically run faster, move more quickly compared to amphibians. That's really all that is. I mean, it was obviously something that was advantageous, but it really doesn't, it's not necessarily tied specifically to dry environments. Okay, so do not worry about memorizing this at all. This is just here mostly for folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about our different lineages of reptiles. So one of our oldest groups are our turtles. You notice the dashed line, though. It's like we don't know exactly where they go. We've got another polytomy back here. We have we have multiple polytomies, right? We've got another one here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 lineages. So we have another, another nice polytomy here, and we've got another one back here. So we really don't know. Some of these relationships are still very tenuous. It's very clear that we have, the iguanas and lizards and snakes are sister taxa. We have somewhere fitting in here, we're not quite sure, our ichthyosaurs. This is our aquatic lizard. You'll notice, right? Look at that. I mean, it looks like I mean, to me, either looks like a shark or a dolphin or some sort of a mix between the two. So convergent evolution is alive and well there. So we have our aquatic. I'm just going to write down this as aquatic lineage. Okay. And we have another aquatic lineage, a separate lineage, our plesiosaurs. And I'm just going to put this on here because I can't resist it. This is what they think. Folks, Loch Ness Monster, the idea is that it's a plesiosaur. It's highly unlikely, but there you have it. So we have multiple aquatic lineages of reptiles, again, that have colonized land and then gone back to water. So this is something that has happened multiple times in mammals as well. And we're going to be looking at that later on. So yeah, do not though worry about relationships here, except, right, so here are our turtles, right, one of our older lineages. Here is our crocodilians here. I've got our pterosaurs, right, so our first flying animal, really, is the pterosaur. And then you have different types of dinosaurs other than birds, and birds. So here's birds, right, well within, entrenched in that dinosaur lineage, right? So everybody else has gone extinct, but birds are the only extant living lineage of dinosaurs. So we basically, we have flying, we would call them avian dinosaurs, right? Or non-avian dinosaurs. And those are our options. All right, so additional evidence, of course, beyond the morphological data and the molecular data, we have behavioral data that shows how closely related birds are to dinosaurs, that birds are actually dinosaurs. We have fossil evidence, right, that of non-avian dinosaurs that were social and built nests and incubated their eggs just like modern birds do. We have actually feathered dinosaurs, right, that didn't fly, didn't have wings, but had feathers. So there's another good piece of evidence there. So reptiles in general, covering getting ready to colonize those dry habitats. So they're having that keratin scales over their skin to prevent desiccation, so prevent them from drying out. This is, of course, a separate origin or separate evolution of scales from fish scales. So these are not, this is homoplasias, this is not homologous. However, when we look at mammal hair, keratin scales, lizard scales, and feathers are basically all just modified keratin scales. So those are all homologous characteristics that are related to each other, distinctly different, but they share the same origin because of shared ancestry. So I already talked about the leathery egg, right? Now, most reptiles, interestingly, right, are ectotherms. They are generally using the environment as the main source of body heat. So you'll see them, again, sunning themselves in the morning, a lizard on the fence or a hot rock or something like that. There's a reason why you don't see a lot of lizards in or snakes, right, in the Arctic, someplace you don't expect to find them. You expect to find them in warmer environments. And that's mainly because they're a lot of big source of body heat is the external environment. So they don't do well in cold habitats. However, several dinosaur lineages were and are endotherms. So they create their own body heat internally through metabolic activity, just like mammals do. And these ones you do find in very cold environments in some cases, things like penguins, right? Frozen Arctic tundra, and there you are. Antarctic, shame on me, Antarctic tundra. And there they are, on that slab of ice. There's our reptile. That's our birds. Okay, so as I mentioned, one of our oldest reptile lineages are the turtles. This is turtles and tortoises. Only big difference, right? A tortoise is on land, a turtle is in the water. They're separate lineages, but very closely related. So you do see the shell that's fused to their vertebrae and to their ribs and their clavicle. So all of the cartoons, right, where you pull the turtle out of a shell, not going to happen, right? I mean, as much as I love the movie Over the Hedge, which is hilarious, and it's a running gag in that movie, but I'm just like, oh no, that's not how that works, it's physically bound to his skeleton. He can't take his shell off. It's not possible. What is interesting is, and has evolved independently in the two different groups, is how they fold their head. How do they retract their head back into the shell for protection? So they either have it as a horizontal neck folding or a vertical neck folding, and it's different in the different lineages. All right. So our other two sister taxa, right, lizards and snakes. So of course, having the keratin scales to keep them from drying out, just like all other reptiles have, right? Mostly carnivorous. There are some herbivorous lizards, but for the most part, they're carnivorous, either eating small insects or small mammals or other reptiles. For example, snakes inject venom through their fangs. Not all are venomous, but some are, of course. Some have the ability to detect infrared radiation through little dimples or little pits in their heads. This is the pit vipers, for example. A snake has got his tongue out and it's forked. He's basically tasting the air, right? So he's sticking his tongue out. It's nice and moist. It's going to grab any chemicals that are in the air, and then he brings it back in his mouth and sticks that forked tongue bit into a specialized olfactory organ. It's called the Jacobson's organ, and essentially up above the roof of his mouth, his palate, and putting that right in close contact with the olfactory bulb of his brain, essentially saying, "Hey, what's out there? I need more information, more sensitivity than I'm just getting through breathing in the chemicals alone. I actually want to bring them into contact with my olfactory bulb in my head." So pretty sophisticated sensory system there, which makes sense. Again, they're predators, so it makes sense. And of course, we have a leg loss again in this group. We also have legless lizards as well, which we saw when we were looking at, again, that convergent evolution exercise where we had the glass lizard, right? It's a legless lizard. And so that's something that has occurred independently in multiple lineages, right? We had leg loss in caecilians and amphibians. We have snakes, we have legless lizards and reptiles. It's occurred multiple times in different groups. All right, our alligators and crocodiles. Alligators on the top, crocodile on the bottom. What the difference is, obviously, other than they're different species, the morphology of their mouth in terms of how the teeth are locked together and where the teeth are located, I know is a big difference between alligators and crocodiles. There's also difference in their gait and how they get around, where you tend to find them. So you generally find, again, notice that they're both next to water. This is something that's somewhat unusual for a reptile, right? A lot of reptiles colonize dry habitats, but alligators and crocodiles didn't. They stayed close to the water, mostly because they use wet plant material in building their nests. So they don't have to, they still have the amniotic egg and that whole thing, right? So they don't need the moisture for the incubation part of it, but they actually use the rotting, all the heat that's given off by the rotting plant material. Essentially incubates their eggs for them, so they don't sit on their nest and brood like birds do, although they do build a nest and they will call back and forth to their eggs, and they come through and they change it and make sure that the eggs are safe. And by manipulating the temperature, they can also control how many male and female offspring they have, because that's how the sex determination is done. In reptiles, in this particular case, it's largely done by temperature. It's not genetic. So, and then once the babies are born, the mothers generally take the babies with them. We see the baby alligators riding on top of mom's head in the top photograph there. I wish I had bring one in of the crocodile with the babies in its mouth. So yeah, mama crocodiles are very, very, again, very fierce. You don't want to mess with them, but they're very gentle with their own babies and be able to pick them up and hold them in their mouth and transport them from one place to another. So it's generally tied to water, specifically for breeding, but also for how they hunt. They're aquatic, and they will can sneak up on their prey or lie in wait at the bottom and lunge and ambush their prey as their prey comes too close to the watering hole or picks the wrong place to cross a river, for example. So they can move extremely quickly over short distances. I mean, once you get out ahead of them, they can't keep it up for a long period of time because they're ectotherms, but they can manage just fine over short distances. So you do not want to get too close, especially crocodiles. Crocodiles in general tend to be more aggressive than alligators. That's just a general trend that we've seen. And alligators, of course, are freshwater only. They don't have the salt glands to be able to get rid of excess salt, so you're not going to find them in any salty habitats. Crocodiles, those function just fine in freshwater, or you have, of course, saltwater crocs. So, of course, I love this little cartoon. I actually ended up taking a picture of it on a friend's. She had it up in her little cubicle in our lab when I was a postdoc, because I didn't know what newspaper it was from. But anyway, so birds being our only living dinosaur lineage, they have a lot of characteristics we associate with predators, of course, excellent eyesight, very sensitive sensory systems in general, good hearing, things like that. Proportionally larger brains than a lot of other reptiles, and the data to back up their problem-solving skills and other things that suggest that they need to be able to remember things like migration routes and things like that. We see a lot of complex behavior, significant parental care, sometimes both male and female, as we saw when we were looking at mating systems. And their shell is, instead of being leathery, it's calcified. It still has holes in it. They're small. In fact, you can see them on any eggs that you purchase at the store. You can see, hold it up to the light, and you can see the holes where you can allow for gas exchange in the embryo through the shell. And then we have feathers. Feathers are modified keratin scales, and they actually lock together, both to act as an airfoil, but also to hold in body heat. Feathers are fantastic insulators. You can trap a layer of air next to your skin, and you've got this nice little warm coat that you can wear around everywhere. So it's a very, very important adaptation for birds in terms of being able to deal with cold weather conditions. got an image of sort of what what feathers look like if you zoom in and kind of look at all the little bits. And this is a big function of preening in birds. And what they're doing is obviously they're grooming. They may be removing lice or other parasites, but a lot of it is just getting their feathers to lock into place properly, right? So you can see you've got the little you've got the hook bit and then this little barb in the next one next door, and basically they all hook together, sort of like those hook and eye closures, and they lock into place. And that's super important in terms of keeping the body heat in the air boundary layer next to the skin, as I mentioned. But of course, that's also important for having a stiff surface to push against to generate lift for flight. So very, very important, a couple of important functions of feathers. And this, of course, is why we look at feathers as a good example, another good example of an exaptation. So we have dinosaur species, as I mentioned, that have feathers but no wings. So likely feathers evolved first and were used for insulation or camouflage or courtship, and then initially, and then were co-opted for use with flight when wings started to evolve. Flight itself probably primarily, gliding, maybe climbing up to a higher point, like a tall branch or something like that, and jumping off and gliding, very much like a flying squirrel does today, right? None of our birds, as far as we can tell, could take off from a standing position when flight first evolved. So Archaeopteryx could not. He had powered flight, but could not take off from a standing position. What's interesting, of course, is that some birds today still can't do that. But mostly because it's the albatross and their wings are so long that when they flap their wings, they would basically hit the ground with their wings fully extended. So they actually have to do a taxi the runway and jump off a cliff essentially and glide in order to get it. They have to get a running start. So again, flight might have evolved as a mechanism to avoid predators or jumping in order to catch prey that's flying, like insects or something like that. We're not really sure. So besides feathers, we have several other physical adaptations that we see in birds specifically for flight. These fall into two major categories. The first being weight reduction, because if you're too heavy, right, it's going to be much more difficult for you to take off. And so in general, we've had the loss of the bladder, which is not a big loss for birds because they use a different waste product anyway. It's not uric acid. Is it uric acid? Yes, it is uric acid. Sorry, use uric acid as a waste product. It's sort of a paste, ammonia paste, and yuck. Which is why, and they dump it directly into their intestine. So that's why bird poop, right, is kind of sticky and runny because they're combining the two waste products together because they don't have a bladder. And they don't want to be diluting that anyway. You don't have to waste the water to do that if you don't have to. So certainly loss of teeth. Again, no teeth in birds. Most females just have one ovary. Their bones are hollow. And then you have other types of adaptations. These are for generating power for flight. So that meaning powering muscles, increasing oxygen supply. So they can actually have powered flight rather than just gliding. And so this would be the four-chambered heart. You're increasing your oxygen supply to muscles, extremely important. The pectoral muscle attachments to the keel. A keel is basically just maybe think about for folks who are not vegetarians, who eat chicken. If you have a whole chicken, right, you'll notice the two breasts on the side. And then there's a piece of cartilage in the middle that's perpendicular to the sternum, and that's the keel. So that's where the muscles are attaching. And the larger the keel, right, the bigger the proportional muscles are that are going to be attached to that. And then there's double respiration. This is a modification of their breathing. And essentially, it takes 2 breaths to cycle the air all the way through the lungs, which is why we call it double respiration. But it's essentially a one-way airflow instead of two-way, like we have two-way, right? You breathe air in, and when you exhale, it has to come back out the same way that it went in. Birds is like a loop. And so they actually have a chambers, and the chambers are lined with, instead of little alveoli sacs, they're lined with these long tubes that have a very high surface area to volume ratio. And so they're essentially able to extract much more efficiently, extract the oxygen from the air that they breathe because they're passing it over these tubes all the way through the lungs. And so by the time it gets back around to the beginning and they exhale out the used air, they've pretty well got all the oxygen out of it. So having that oxygen supply really important for mitochondria, for cellular respiration, to make ATP. And so that's mainly the function of that 4-chambered heart and the double respiration in terms of increasing power for flight. And while it's generally accepted that Archaeopteryx was definitely a bird, it's not necessarily clear if it was the first bird, since we have found some subsequent fossils that are a little bit earlier, so it's not quite sure. We're not quite sure exactly whether Archaeopteryx was the first. There's still some debate there, but it was definitely a bird. And as you can see in this artist's rendering, it retains a lot of reptilian types of characteristics, of course, including having teeth and claws on its limbs, so limbs with digits, right? And again, likely could not take off from a standing position. What's interesting is just like we've had terrestrial lineages go back to the water in reptiles and mammals, we have had leg loss, so you've evolved limbs with digits, and then you lose those, right, in legless lizards and caecilians and snakes. Flight has been lost in some birds. So they retain the wings, but they can't actually fly. So things like, ostriches, rheas, emus are too large. So running is their defense instead of flying. And we have other flightless birds like kiwis and penguins. Although you certainly can make the argument that penguins fly underwater. They still, they flap their wings, right, their flippers up and down to propel them forward through the water. So you can certainly make that argument there. You also see a lot of interesting modifications to the shape of the beak. And this is going to be something that's reflected when we were talking about insects, right? The changes in the shape of the mouth parts, and based on whether you have piercing mouth parts, chewing, etc., you can tell what that animal eats based on their mouth morphology, basically their beak morphology in birds. And so, of course, we have hummingbirds that hover, can actually fly backwards, have a long tube-like beak for drinking nectar. We have some that are, of course, obviously evolved for crushing large seeds, like the toucan here. And on the left, we have a flamingo beak. And that actually has adaptations that look very much like baleen, and it's used by whales to strain the food out. They take it in a mouthful of water and then push their tongue up against the baleen. It's like a sieve. It's a little filter. And anything that's bigger than the holes in the filter stays behind, and you get to eat that. And then the water and the stuff that you don't want like dirt and things like that, can go back out the other side. And so that's what we have interesting modifications to the beak, especially in flamingos. And just because I can't resist it, I've got a video clip here of taken from a BBC series called Spy on the Huddle that I use in my Marine Birds and Mammals course. And so this is sort of the bloopers. It's the blooper reel. And so it's basically penguins being silly and falling and bouncing all over the place. Which brings me to mammals, which of course is us, right? So we have placental mammals, we have marsupials, and then there are monotremes, which are bizarre egg-laying mammals, very strange. Okay, so what makes a mammal, right? Mammary glands that produce milk. Nipples are not a requirement, notice, just the glands, right? Hair, these are modified keratin scales that are used to insulate. There's another, one orbital fenestra is another shared derived character. We're going to get to that here in just a second. But for now, we'll talk about other general characteristics of mammals, very similar to those of birds. Four-chambered heart, large brain size, extensive parental care. We're endotherms, so we have that metabolic activity used to generate our body heat internally. Just like with birds, with specialization of beak morphology, we have specialization of teeth morphology. Reptile teeth are generally all cone-shaped, right? So fairly undifferentiated, whereas we have heterodont dentition. So you have specialized for different purposes, like we saw we were talking about predators versus or herbivores versus carnivores in terms of their teeth form. And so, for example, we're omnivores, so we have flat grinding molars as well as sharper cutting teeth in the front. Okay, so a third shared derived character for mammals is this single or temporal fenestra. A temporal just means it's on your temples, right? It's on the side of your head. And fenestra, of course, is just the hole. And essentially, it's there's like a little arch behind your eye socket that's allowing the muscles to come up from your jaw, essentially under your cheekbone, and through this little hole and attach onto the side of your skull. And this, of course, your chewing muscles. At the same time that we had this change, so other animals, for example, are diapsids. A lot of our extinct dinosaurs were diapsids, right? Living reptiles, I think a lot of them are also diapsids. They have two holes instead of just the one. And so about the same time that this was change in the skull morphology was happening, you had some changes to the bones in our inner ear, in our middle ear, excuse me. Not the inner ear, the middle ear. So we have a reptile ear on the left, and you'll notice that there are a couple of bones that are missing compared to the mammal ear on the right, right? So you just have the stapes, and the stapes is a very different shape in the reptile ear compared to the mammal ear. And so we have these two extra bones, and those bones actually migrated up from the hinge of our jaw, which is not that far to have to go. Actually, if you feel right on your jaw, it's like the hinge is right below your earlobe. So it's really not that far to have to go. And again, these moving during embryonic development. So here we have another good example of an exaptation. You have something that was originally used as part of the hinge mechanism in the jaw and now is used for sound. I don't want to say translation, but I guess that's probably the best way. Translation or transformation or interpretation of sound waves that are coming in from the environment, right? They hit the eardrum, which is a membrane, and starts vibrating. and it vibrates the bones in the middle ear, and they start bumping into each other, and so it essentially translates along the vibration and amplifies some wavelengths and dampens others, and then finally the stapes smacks into the little oval window there in your cochlea that sets up a vibration in a liquid-filled space, and it stimulates little hairs that line that space, and those are sensitive to different frequencies, and that's what's triggering the neural impulses in our brains, and that's how we interpret sound. Okay, so we have our ancestors of mammals started emerging again, generally most of the niches available were dominated by very large dinosaurs. The mammals that were around were small, tended to be eating insects, and still laid eggs. And so we have 3 different lineages in mammals, actually. We have our oldest, our basal taxon, would be the monotremes. These are our egg-laying mammals, such as the duck-billed platypus on the top or the echidna on the bottom. And so not only do these guys still lay eggs, they don't have any nipples. They do have mammary glands. They are technically mammals, right? They have fur. They have a single orbital fenestra. They have mammary glands, but no nipples. So essentially, the milk gets secreted out onto their fur, and the babies just sort of lick it up off the surface of the fur itself. Of course, once our non-avian dinosaurs went bye-bye, we had all these open niches, and that, of course, allowed for a huge adaptive radiation for mammals to fill those particular jobs. Generally, those were filled by placental mammals, except on the island of Australia and islands of Australia and New Zealand, which at the time were connected. They're not now, but they were at the time. And those were then filled by marsupials instead. The rest of placental mammals is the pouch. Well, one, the pouch. So a lot of the embryonic development, and by a lot I mean most, the embryonic development is completed outside of the uterus. It's actually completed in the pouch. So we can see that a baby kangaroo, this is, very embryo, basically a kangaroo embryo, on the bottom right here is latched onto the nipple and is sucking away. You can see the eyes are barely formed. The ears are still really not. The front limbs are decently established. The back limbs are fused together. It's just really kind of a mess still. Very, very early embryonic stage. And so a lot of that development's the rest of the development's going to happen outside of the uterus. What this means for them, of course, is they can be pregnant. They can have a early to mid-stage embryo nursing in the pouch. And then they can have a late-stage offspring. We call it joey, right? That can climb in and out of the pouch and will come back to nurse and then leave. What I find interesting is that the females are able to manipulate the type of milk that goes to each mammary gland independently. So they use a lot richer milk with the early embryo stage, which makes sense. They need more energy for growth and development than for your later stage where they're taking solid food and other things. And the animal on the top right is, you guys might have seen these going around Facebook and memes. The happiest animal on earth. That's just their face. It's like, you don't have resting, bitch face. You have resting happy face. But they look like they're smiling. That's just how their face is. But someone sent me a message and said, here's a quokka. This is again, it's a marsupial. And so it's related to, wombats and kangaroos and all of that. And so this is a quokka. And he's just, they always have a look on their face like, oh, hey, how are you? Nice to see you. Oh, you brought pie. Very happy look on their face. And again, that's just their face. But, who can, we always need more pictures of cute animals, to be honest. Much fun to say. Um, so after Pangea broke up, right, we had that one big, basically giant landmass in the middle. Everybody's all the continents are all all connected together, and then they start to break up. So we have continental drift, and North and South America, to leave Africa and Europe and start drifting away. And at some point, Australia drifts away from the continent of Africa. And of course, the ancestor to placental mammals was on the African continent, and the ancestor to our marsupials was on Australian continent. And so that means that, again, those niches that were left behind by our non-avian dinosaurs when they went extinct were filled by marsupials. What's also very cool, of course, is because they're doing the same job, they're in similar selective pressures, and we have great examples of convergent evolution between the continents. So, for example, we have flying squirrels here in North America. Well, the sort of functional equivalent marsupial is the sugar glider. You notice the moles, we have very, very similar. And they're similar, partially they're going to be, they're similar because they're mammals, but they're going to be similar in terms of adaptations because they are living in the same environment, and they're subjected to the same selective pressures because of their particular lifestyle, right? So burrowing into the ground, certain characteristics are going to be favored, for example. And so they're a great example of convergent evolution here. Again, most of the marsupials confined to Australia and New Zealand. Our one exception, as I mentioned earlier, is the opossum. And this is a guy that started, again, had left, the ancestor had left Australia, then the continents broke up, and he migrated to South America. South America then, right, disengages from Africa. And he was confined to South America for quite a while. And then about 3 million years ago, North and South America came together, right? We had the Isthmus of Panama. And suddenly now there was the ability to migrate up to the north. And we also had species that migrated from North America to South America as well. But the possum managed to make it from South America up through Panama and into North America and spread all across North America. They're extremely successful species. So that's how we managed to end up with a marsupial, a native marsupial in North America. Okay, so big differences, as I mentioned, is just when the embryo completes its development. So in placental mammals, it's completed inside the uterus, and then the mother gives birth to the offspring. And of course, we did, who can resist, good pictures of all of our charismatic megafauna like elephants and tigers and cool creatures like fruit bats. They're so stinking cute. They're so cute. I can't stand it. So I know I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about convergence, evolution, and difference between homologous and homoplasious traits. So we have flight, again, has evolved independently at least 4 different times, right? We had pterosaurs, which are flying lizards that are extinct. We have flight has evolved once in insects. It's involved in bats. So we have bat wings that are similar in their structure to a pterosaur wing because it's basically a thin membrane of skin stretched between the bones. But it's evolved independently a couple of times there. And then, of course, you have bird wings. So the evolution of flight itself is totally homoplasious, but the bones involved between the pterosaur and the bird wing and the bat wing are going to be homologous because they share a shared ancestor from where those bones came from. They've just been, bones themselves have been modified for different jobs. Okay, so just like we had, right, we had ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. We had reptile lineages return to the ocean, right? We've had birds, which are, of course, also reptiles, return to the ocean, penguins, for example. We have had mammal lineages also return to the ocean. So you had all this trouble, right? All limbs in the first place, and what are we going to do? We'll go back to the water. It's okay. It's fine. And this has happened actually several times independently in different lineages within mammals. So at least, most likely about 5 or 6 times, right? So we have our otters, polar bears most recently. They're sort of the least well adapted to an aquatic existence so far. We have manatees and dugongs, which is manatees are on the bottom left there. Their closest relatives are actually elephants. They're our only vegetarian marine mammal, which is pretty cool. We have our pinnipeds, our seals, sea lions, and walruses, who are all in carnivora. So the closest relatives are weasels, for example. Also fairly closely related to dogs and things like that. Canids. And then you have whales and dolphins, right? Which is the closest relatives are actually, well, tapirs and hippos and pigs and things like that. Their closest living relatives. So again, this has happened, you know, at least 5 separate times. You've had mammals decide to go back to the water. And of course, we notice the thing that's conspicuously absent, right, is, well, you have pectoral flippers, which look a lot like fish fins, right? And you've lost those limbs, especially the back limbs are gone. You can still see on several large whale skeletons, you can still see vestigial femurs. They're very small, and they're not actually connected to the pelvis anymore. It's very strange. You still get, it's been a more recent trip back to the ocean for our seals and sea lions. So sea lions and walruses, for example, can rotate their pelvis underneath them and get around on land a little bit better than, say, seals can, who can't do that. Manatees have had the same thing with whales and dolphins. I've lost their limbs, and then they've had the tail is now this very large tail that's used for propulsion. So this has happened multiple times. We have mammals going back to the water, and of course they still breathing air, still have hair, still have mammary glands, right? All those mammal characteristics still at play, even though they are living an aquatic existence.